NFT.
This is Brian Lehrer Live. We're here live every Wednesday night this fall at 7:30. Last year, the search engine Google, not content with conquering the world of web content, announced an almost unbelievably ambitious project to scan and digitize every book in the top libraries and universities in the United States, plus Oxford in the UK. Sure enough, just a year later, the service known as Google Print is up and running, but with a glaring exception: any book with a copyright. That's because a group representing authors and publishers filed a lawsuit against Google saying it may not digitize their books without permission or some money thrown their way to buy rights for their intellectual property. Google says it enjoys the protection of the so-called fair use laws since it would only offer a small portion of each book at a time. In the meantime, Google is postponing plans to include copyrighted works on Google Print as the lawsuit plays out. So we'll get two views on this from Pat Schroeder, former Congresswoman from Colorado, now president of the Association of American Publishers, and Siva Vaidhyanathan. He's a cultural historian and media scholar at NYU and author of the book Copyrights and Copy Wrongs: The Rise of Intellectual Property and How It Threatens Creativity. Welcome to Brian Lehrer Live.
Thank you.
And Siva, let me start with you. Sure. We're going to show a page or two of Google Print on the screen here. And why don't you describe for our viewers what this is and how it works.
Sure. When you think about Google Print, or actually when you go to the page, it's print.google.com, it's important to remember that Google Print is actually the combination of two separate projects. There's the publisher project, which is authorized, so publishers have actually licensed their works for that. And many of the searches you would do today would actually generate books that are authorized to be on the project. But the library project is really the controversial part. And that's what we have displayed. Well, the first page that we saw was the library project. This is an example of a page submitted by a publisher. That would be
that's over now.
Okay, sorry. Anyway, it's a confusing branding issue, and I think Google's made a grand mistake by confusing people. Basically, they have an authorized section that publishers have gladly offered their work for, and these are limited access formats. Their readers are able to see a few pages at a time. They're not allowed to print anything, and they're guided to places on the web where you can buy books. But it's the library project that's really controversial. In this case, the library project, Google is, without permission, without payment, scanning, as you said, millions of books, most of which actually have been published since 1923, and so we can assume are still under copyright, and they're presenting it in little snippets as you search. So their argument, Google's argument, is that the snippet itself is such a limited portion of the entire work that it must qualify under fair use.
So could I download whole books or whole chapters the way Google Print wants to do this?
Not if Google's system works as it promises. Now, no system is unhackable. We all know that. But Google's argument is, through its strong digital rights management format, it's going to only allow you to see a handful of words around the search terms, the keywords in context. Now, of course,
what's a handful? A
handful might be 30, it might be 50, it might be 10. It's really, it varies. And as I've looked through models of how they're doing this, it varies greatly. So you can't really get much from a search like that.
So, Pat Schroeder, why is that a threat to the publishers?
The threat is really about the copying of the full work. The law says you can't make a copy of a full work without the permission of the copyright holder. I mean, most people have opened their books and it says you cannot copy this book. And it's just very clear. What Google is doing in Google Library is making two full copies. One they're leaving with the library, and the library can do anything they want. They're not snippet bound or whatever. So that's just like, trust the library, and we have no connection with the library, obviously, if you're a publisher or an author.
Libraries buy books from publishers.
They buy books, but now they've got a digital copy, and they can do anything they want to with it that's been given to them by Google as payment for being allowed to copy the entire library collection. Then Google will make another copy for themselves. Now, the problem with what they're saying about snippets is it's not a legal term. They don't have a contract with anybody on that, and they can change snippet any day. Snippet could become a chapter, snippet could become a book, snippet could become anything they wanted it to be because it's not defined anywhere, and there's nobody that could enforce it if they changed it.
We just saw people walking through library stacks on the screen. Is that going to become a thing of the past if Google gets its way?
I actually don't think so. First of all, the nature of what Google presents is pretty much unusable as a book as it stands now, unless, as Congresswoman Schroeder has described, the snippets get bigger, and we don't know if that's going to happen. But look, libraries are still important parts of people's lives. They're still where people go to encounter books serendipitously, to encounter many media forms. The web hasn't replaced libraries. It's really worked as an extension of libraries in some important ways.
Is that true? I mean, I used to go to the library so much more as a journalist than I do anymore because of the web.
Mm-hmm. Well, look, libraries play a lot of different functions in our lives. If you go to the Brooklyn Public Library on a Saturday afternoon, you will see every desk filled with 8-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 50-year-olds, and they're doing their homework, they're reading books together, they have book reading groups. There are many ways people use libraries.
Pat Schroeder, I'm no expert on publishing economics, but I would think that it would be to the benefit of the publishers to have millions of people out there searching terms that they're interested in and then coming up with book titles that they never heard of that are still copyrighted, still in print. They read these 30 words or whatever it is, and if they're interested enough, then the next step is they're going to go out and buy the book, isn't it?
Right. You know, that could be, and there'll be many publishers and authors who agree, and in Google Print, as you so well said, many publishers and authors did agree, and it's there, and we do it with Amazon. Amazon, we have search inside the book, and Yahoo and Microsoft, and there's all sorts of people that are doing it correctly.
Does Amazon pay the publishers for this search inside the book function?
Each publisher can cut their own deal. If they think it's going to be so good for them that they're just happy to be on the service, you know, they cut their own deal. We as an association don't do that. That's a business plan. But what we're concerned about is the copyright aspect of it, because if Google can go make a full copy, then so can anybody else. I mean, it's not a special carve-out just for Google. And here's the real issue. The real issue is, look, we totally revere what they've done. They've created a brilliant, brilliant search engine. But if there weren't people writing things, there wouldn't be anything to search. So, you know, we just ask that they respect the creators on the other side. Creators respecting creators,
right.
as
so
the others have.
This is a good thing for the world, and it's going to be good for us because people are going to search and find our books, but it can be better for us because they should pay us once to be able to make the full copy.
Maybe they're going to give it free. They're not saying, many people did not ask for pay. What they're asking for is either they share in the advertising revenue. Well, look, let's look at newspapers. I mean, you know, Google went to newspapers, and they've got a lot of newspapers out there. And what we're really seeing now is that Google's increasing all the advertising. They're taking the advertising. Now, who's going to pay for the boots-on-the-ground journalists in the end? Because newspapers are having to lay people off. When you have a 700% increase in revenue in 1 quarter and 97% of your revenues from advertising, they've got a very good model. But their model is they don't pay for the content.
But Google doesn't take the newspapers. Google just indexes and lets you search through, wait a minute, the free newspaper websites that the newspapers have already put up. See, is that not true?
In fact, they do take the newspapers. In fact, this is Google. The way Google works, the norm of the web is that Google copies everything. So this is what Google's basically arguing here is, we've been doing this for years. We copy every page on the web. And if you don't want to have your web page copied, you actually put a little signal in your web page. You opt out of the system. So Google's saying, we're just going to do to the real world what we've been doing to the web world for years.
Right.
So we have a clash of norms here.
Right.
Copyright in the web world is basically opt out. Copyright in the real world is opt in.
Right. But when I search news.google, right, which I use all the time, and come up with, let's say, a Wall Street Journal article, the Wall Street Journal website is not free for most of its material. So it may get indexed on Google. It may get referred to in my web search, but then I'm going to be blocked from actually going to the site because I'm not a paying subscriber.
Actually, whatever the journal doesn't want seen, they will actually prevent from being indexed. The journal will offer you certain of its pages for free. So there are certain firms, and the Wall Street Journal has a very strong presence and a brand name, so it can do that. But most web pages, they want to be searched.
So then Pat has a point, which is that if Google can copy whole books for free, then anybody would start being able to copy whole books for free, which we can't do now legally.
That's why I think this is the most interesting copyright question that courts have faced in a century. You know, peer-to-peer was nothing on this. Music downloading, nothing. That wasn't a really interesting question. This is really about what kind of copyright system we're going to have in the next century. The one that has worked in the real world for 2 or 3 centuries has been pretty good, but it might not serve all of our needs in the future. But then the question is Google the right party to be doing this? Are they, in fact, vacuuming up every spare penny from web revenue at the expense of other people? Are they being too aggressive? Do they even have a strong fair use case being such a profitable enterprise? The role of libraries in this is almost passive, and that's, I think, a shame, because Google is putting on the veneer of public service here. But it's actually taking a very bold commercial step and wanting people to focus on the public service aspect.
You said the role of libraries is almost passive here, but the New York Public Library, for example, very actively signed up with Google to be a partner in this venture.
But they did it right. I mean, they're only allowing the stuff in the public domain, which is very clear, as did Oxford. You know, as did but it's the 3 libraries that have blurred the line. That's the concern.
New York Public Library.
Well, New York Public Library and Oxford have done it fine. We have no quarrels with them.
Okay.
But Stanford, Harvard, and the University of Michigan have said that they can do a much broader search than just be, or much broader copying than just beyond the things that are in public domain.
But the libraries are essentially outsourcing both the risk and the reward to Google. And what they're getting in return is a copy that they might or might not be able to use in a reasonable way. But the important part is here that they have basically decided that what might be a really cool thing for libraries to do, and libraries have a special status under copyright, they've instead allowed a corporation to do in a relatively short period of time. This creates all sorts of unanswerable questions. The courts are going to be wrestling with this for years.
What's the difference really between a copyrighted book and a public domain book? I'll bet a lot of viewers don't really know what that difference means.
Well, copyright is a limited. You're allowed a copyright for a limited period of time. So most things pre-1923 would be clearly in public domain.
That's a long time ago.
That's a long time ago. But those are some of the great things that you really want to see. I mean, those are some of the things that are hardest to get because obviously they're out of print in most cases.
It's one of the great values of libraries, that they would keep things
that's
that
right.
are that old.
And it will be wonderful to have that digitally out there for the whole world to be able to view, rather than you have to get 15 special security passes to get back into the stacks to find it out. So that, you know, we think that's wonderful. It is just this imminent issue of the stuff that is currently under copyright.
So everything that's been published since 1923 is currently under copyright?
Almost.
Yes, there's some that are called orphan works. Now, what is an orphan work? That is something that's probably under copyright, but that nobody's really claimed it for a while.
I would actually argue that most works published since 1923 are orphan works, in the sense it's impossible to do research. It's impossible to find out who owns most stuff. So for anybody who wants to do this, whether it's Google or a library, you can't actually clear the rights. You can't actually get permission because you don't know who owns most of the works published in the 20th century. There's no database at the Copyright Office.
And the very good news is that the Congress is now working on that through the Copyright Office. We're at the table, Google's at the table. Everybody's trying to figure out how to solve this orphan work thing because everybody understands it's a problem. But then there's the more contemporary works, which is what people really want. I mean, this is your Harry Potter, which is clearly under, you know, this is your The March by Dr.
Nobody can get Harry Potter this way, right? Google would have it there, but you can't download Harry Potter and give it to your kid through Google Print, right?
Well, but first of all, you're assuming no one hacks. Now, I got to tell you, when somebody stands up and says, in just a few years, we're going to have all the information in the world right here, to me, that is kind of a little signal to hackers. Wouldn't that be fun? You know, there's a big guy.
But how
and
about
hackers
e-books?
are good.
E-books exist today, but nobody uses them.
But, well, we've tried we do have our stuff digitized, and they're out there. And that may very well be, but don't forget the library's also going to have one, and maybe they decide that they'll put Harry Potter up with their digital thing for everybody in their library system. You know, that's a possibility. But the real thing is that they've gone, if they could go in and make a copy, then why can't you go in with your scanner and make a copy for your kid and go home and print it out?
But you are putting ebooks out there affirmatively. The publishers
of course we are.
And you're not saying, well, we're not going to do this because there's a risk that somebody might hack them.
Oh, yeah, but you don't copy them. You can't copy them.
I also think there's a pretty clear right now to make your own personal digital copy anyway. So the real risk here is, as Congressman Schroeder has pointed out, the security risk in terms of hacking.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one risk. But the real thing here is that there's a potential market for publishers to license many of these works to Google or some other entity, and that market is sort of being drowned out by the unauthorized copying. So I think we've often made a mistake by focusing on book sales. It's not really about book sales. No. It's about those secondary, tertiary markets that are just starting to develop right now. Yeah. So we then have to ask ourselves how important those markets are, and is the public service going to outweigh that?
Well, as you well know, I mean, publishers have been slicing and dicing their material and selling it in pieces for a long time. We're sitting here in a university. Well, course packs. I mean, that has been forever. So publishers have always been willing to sell portions of their work to different people, and the digital age is a really huge business opportunity for that. But you also have the threat of, if you're a poet, if you have recipe books, if you're a reference book, a lot of those books could be damaged too by the Google search later on, we think. I mean, we don't know. Everybody's just projecting. But why don't you ask permission and let the author of that kind of book, let the poet decide whether he's going to be hurt or she's going to be hurt?
Siva, do you think that copyright laws, as we have known them, are fundamentally outdated, that technology is making copyright, as we usually think of it, obsolete?
Well, not exactly. I kind of think the opposite. I think copyright worked really well in the 70s. I think we've actually corrupted it in the past 5 years by allowing the movie studios and the record industry to basically write the laws for us without recognizing important public rights, without recognizing, for instance, the fact that the public domain belongs to all of us and should be easier to use and should constantly grow. Instead, we've let these large copyright industries basically call the shots.
What do you mean the movie industry has corrupted copyright, and has the publishing industry corrupted
Well,
copyright?
the publishing industry has not really been at the table in the same ways. They haven't been as aggressive in this, largely because the publishing industry also understands the value of the public domain. The publishing industry understands fair use. The publishing industry is just as aware that it uses copyrighted material as much as produces it. So it's basically a lot cooler and a lot smarter.
So what did the movie industry do?
Well, for one thing, the copyright extension that Congress passed in 1998 was basically to protect Mickey Mouse. Mickey Mouse was about to enter the public domain and in 2003, and Disney made sure that all copyrights, even stuff going way back to 1923, was extended by 20 years for no real reason at all except to protect their own interests. So that stole from us.
What about the 9/11 Commission report as a new model? That's an uncopyrighted book, and it's sold a gazillion copies.
Yeah. I mean, that's fine. You're absolutely right. I mean, publishers are for that. We've done those kind of things. We've done public copies. We've done...
The Norton version of that actually sold remarkably well,
and
you could download it off the web for free if you wanted
Right,
to.
but Norton's making a ton of money.
That's right. No,
But
they were very smart. But they've done that before. I mean, people in publishing have done that multiple times where they've taken a public report and published it, mainly because people still don't like to read that much on a screen.
Right.
I remember even reading Bill Gates saying he prints it out if it's more than 3 pages. That made me feel so much better.
It's also important to remember...
But what does that do to the argument about hackers? I mean, are people really going to hack Harry Potter, download 900 pages, and distribute it for $8.95 instead of $20?
It's become a serious enough thing on many campuses where the campuses have had to put a limit on how many pages kids can download, because they're printing out, 900 pages or 100,000 pages or something. And so they're saying, whoa. Once you get to the 900-page limit or the 1,000-page limit, some universities are now charging the kids per page for their download. So, I mean,
well, it's easier to buy a copy and scan in every page than it is to hack. And people do that now. I mean, you can get electronic versions of Harry Potter right now. Give me half an hour, I can find you. Yeah. It's not that's been out there.
I have a computer right here.
Even though they're not legitimate.
Sure.
Right. Didn't Google also propose a rental system where you can gain access to a book for a half hour or half a day, whatever it is?
Well, Google's position is that it still wants to play ball with the publishing industry. And so one of the things it wants to offer the publishing industry or cut a deal on is this notion of electronic versions that would disappear after a while, which is why, as someone who's a critic of strong copyright regimes and digital rights management schemes as being sort of cumbersome and ultimately futile, I see that as a big boondoggle. I think that that's basically a disaster waiting to happen on all sides. But nonetheless, Google's trying to be as creative as possible in the ways that it invites the publishing industry into its business.
You'll make people mad because they'll buy it and they won't have time to read it in the 2 days. Something will come up and then it'll disappear and then they're going to be angry about that.
So maybe an iTunes model, pay by the chapter.
Well, maybe. I mean, but look, everybody's struggling. I mean, Random House came up with theirs, but you can pay by the page. I mean, all sorts of people are trying to look for the right formula. But it goes back to the fact that they're still trying to ignore the whole writing creators. They're not paying any attention to those. It's like, we've created this, and we're going to take your stuff. It's like, no, 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 you have to at least talk to them and try and work something out. Maybe Google will have the best solution in the end. Maybe the individual publishers will come up with better business models, but somebody's got to figure it out.
So we're almost out of time. What is the solution here? You're taking Google to court.
Right.
What would the criteria for settlement be here? Give me a potential settlement.
It's very simple. We are humble people. We are only asking that the court declare that we are right. We're asking for a declaration from the court that we are correct, that to make
that's
a copy...
That's not a settlement, that's a victory.
No, but that's, I mean, they have to have permission to make a copy, which we feel is the copyright law as it stands now.
There's no middle ground in this, and I think that that's really what it's going to come down to. I actually, as much as it breaks my heart, I predict that the publishers will win this, largely because the norms of the copyright world, the real world for the last couple hundred years, will end up triumphing.
And why does it break your heart? Won't Google then just have to pay some royalties and this whole enterprise will go on anyway?
No, Google just won't do it. Google will continue with its publisher program, and as an author, I get no royalties
Too
from
expensive?
That, so.
Is that why they wouldn't do it?
Yeah, too risky, basically.
But Microsoft will. Amazon may, Yahoo may. I mean, and there's probably some people maybe on this campus that will come up with the next search engine that will figure out how to do it. Or maybe the publishers will do it. In Germany, the publishers are putting it together themselves.
In France, the government's doing it.
We're almost out of time. We've been talking about music file sharing in this country incessantly for years now. Is this the next big thing in this realm? Is this going all the way to the Supreme Court?
It's going to the Supreme Court, but it's a very different question. The music downloading thing was about whether you can make technology that would profit off of this behavior. The behavior continues regardless of what happened in court.
Sure.
But this particular case is really about the very essence of copyright.
That's Siva, the web expert, not Siva, the author, speaking.
No,
presume.
both.
And Pat Schroeder, thank you very much. Thank you both. And you can see this debate continue in person if you're interested at the New York Public Library tomorrow evening at 7 in the Celeste Bartos Forum. We'll continue in a minute. This is Brian Lehrer Live.
There is really only one boy. One girl. One tree. One forest. One deep, dancing ocean. One mountain calling. One handful of sand through our fingers. One endless sky overhead. And one simple way to care for it all. Please visit earthshare.org and learn how the world's leading environmental groups are working together under one name, EarthShare. One environment, one simple way to care for it.
Hi, I'm Matthew Goldstein. November is CUNY month. New Yorkers are choosing CUNY colleges in record numbers. We have a world-class faculty and state-of-the-art facilities, and our students continue to win the highest awards and honors. Reach for the stars during CUNY month. Call us at 1-800-CUNY-YES. Find us at cuny.edu. Visit the CUNY college of your choice and invest in CUNY now. Thank you.
This is Brian Lehrer Live. We're here live every Wednesday night this fall at 7:30. Now, the U.S. went to war in Iraq supposedly for two reasons: to stop Saddam Hussein's weapons program and to prevent Iraq and al-Qaeda from working together to export terrorism in the post-9/11 world. The debate is already raging in the U.S. over whether the intelligence about weapons was purposely hyped. And now the hotel bombings in Jordan appear to be the first instance of the group al-Qaeda in Iraq exporting terrorism. So has the war created the very thing it was supposedly launched to prevent? With me now to explore that question and to look more deeply into the state of the global jihad movement is Fawaz Gerges, professor of Middle East Studies at Sarah Lawrence College and author of a new book called The Far Enemy, Why Jihad Went Global, published by the Cambridge University Press. Professor Gerges, welcome to Brian Lehrer Live.
It's my pleasure.
Talk about this idea from the title of your book, the far enemy versus the near enemy. Who are they?
Well, Brian, since the birth of the jihadist movement in the late 1990s, the major focal point of jihadists was on the near enemy. The near enemy meant secular, pro-Western Muslim leaders. That is the Egyptian government, the Algerian government, the Jordanian governments. So from the late 1970s until the late 1990s, the main focal point of jihadists was on the near enemy. A major transformation took place in the late 1990s. From the late 1990s onward now, the main focus of jihadists now is on the far enemy. That is the United States and its Western allies. So a major divide took place in the late 1990s, away from concentrating and targeting pro-secular Muslim leaders to targeting the United States and its Western allies.
So you had Osama bin Laden, on the one hand, wanting to target the far enemy, the United States, and other al-Qaeda leaders wanting to focus on the near enemy, the repressive Arab governments primarily?
Not only that, the bulk of jihadists, the bulk of militant Islamists, those activists who believe in the use of violence to capture power and establish an Islamic State, still believe that the fight should be focused on local governments as opposed to the far enemy, that's the United States and its Western allies. A small faction within the jihadist movement, led by Osama bin Laden and his second-in-command, Ayman Zawahiri, believed that the best way to go about toppling Muslim government is to target the far enemy, the United States and its Western allies. Why not hit two birds in one stone? Expel American influence from the region, and this way you can topple pro-Western secular Muslim leaders.
Why did Osama bin Laden win that debate within the jihadist movement, or did he?
He did not. In fact, since the late 1990s, Brian, and this is really one of the most overlooked points in the debate in the United States, there is a civil war raging within the jihadist movement between the two camps, the local camp and the international camp led by Osama bin Laden, Ayman Zawahiri. In fact, the international camp led by al-Qaeda is a tiny fringe, not only within the Islamist movement, but also within the jihadist movement.
But a very powerful tiny fringe if we assume that the 9/11 attacks, the 7/7 attacks in London, plus Bali and Jordan and Spain and all of that is part of the far enemy movement.
You know, Brian, we made some blunders. At the end of the 1990s, we underestimated al-Qaeda's reach and power because we said, well, listen, the largest segment within the jihadist movement was the local segment. We underestimated all it takes really a few hundred fighters, let alone a few thousand fighters. Yes, al-Qaeda represents a major national security threat as opposed to an existential and strategic threat. I mean, if you really listen to the debate, the internal war taking place among jihadists, you realized that al-Qaeda is a tiny fringe within a fringe in the Islamist movement. By understanding the civil war that's taking place among jihadists, we come to appreciate al-Qaeda is not, we should not equate al-Qaeda with communism or fascist. It's a small, tiny, fringe movement. Yes, it represents a national security threat. It does not represent a strategic, existential threat either to the United States or even to Muslim rulers for that matter.
If they were to get a nuclear bomb, they would, wouldn't they?
Absolutely. And Al-Qaeda, we know since, we know now, that is, I have read almost all the diaries and personal memos written by Al-Qaeda members, and in fact, since the mid-1990s, a small faction within Al-Qaeda has been trying very hard to acquire nuclear weapons and non-conventional weapons. Their efforts did not take them anywhere. But of course, it's a possibility, it's a serious possibility. We cannot overlook this particular possibility.
We're very lucky to have Fawaz Gerges with us in our studio tonight and available to take your phone calls. So if you have a question to ask him on the nature of Al-Qaeda and the larger jihadi movement, how to fight them, who they are, anything at all, give us a call. You see the number on your screen, 212-251-0801, 212-251-0801. The bombings in Jordan last week, would you call that near enemy or far enemy?
This is really a highly critical question. On the one hand, Al-Qaeda, the international camp, says we must focus the fight on the far enemy, the United States and its allies. Now the lines have become blurred between the near enemy, that is local Muslim governments, and the far enemy, the United States. And Al-Qaeda now is fighting its war in the heart of the Arab and Muslim world, that is in Jordan, in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt, in Yemen, in Indonesia and Iraq. And this is why it seems to me the international camp now is losing the war for Arab and Muslim hearts and minds, because most of its victims, the overwhelming number of its victims, are Arabs and Muslims, not crusaders and infidels.
Last week, of course, Jordan was hit with a suicide attack. Now, this is the woman whose detonator failed, speaking the next day on Jordan TV. Remember, they arrested that woman, and she did talk. All right.
My husband wore an explosive packed belt and put one on me. He taught me how to use it. My husband detonated his bomb and I tried to explode my belt, but it wouldn't. People fled running and I left running with them.
So the Jordan attack took place. We've seen demonstrations in the streets of Jordan against Al-Qaeda. Do you think these demonstrations are genuine, or are they just ginned up by the king?
Well, I think you might say both. On the one hand, the government has tried to rally public opinion against Al-Qaeda and against Zarqawi. But it seems to me, Brian, I think if I read the situation correctly, we have arrived at a tipping point. Arab and Muslim public opinion is already turning against Al-Qaeda and the global jihad movement. More and more Arabs and Muslims saying, listen, enough is enough. On the one hand, you say you're fighting the far enemy. On the other hand, most of your victims are Arabs and Muslims. And I think we have reached this particular tipping point in the last few weeks or few months.
Do you think it affects Jordanians when they see that woman and the fact that she is a woman go on Jordanian television and say, okay, I tried this, it failed, and there is a human face, a female face no less, to the movement that tried to kill Jordanians as well as foreigners?
Many Jordanians, not just Jordanians, many Arabs and Muslims are outraged. They're angry. In fact, some Arab correspondents went to Zarqa. Zarqa, Brian, is the birthplace of Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi. Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi is the leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And some of his most loyal neighbors said those attacks were un-Islamic. Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi must repent. Those attacks are deviant. There is, I think, a change in the air. As I said, it seems to me Arab and Muslim public opinion is turning against Al-Qaeda, because Al-Qaeda is no longer fighting the war against the far enemy. Al-Qaeda is fighting its war in the heart of the Arab and Muslim world, and the overwhelming number of its victims are Arabs and Muslims, not Americans and Westerners.
Let's take a phone call for you. Rishi in Gramercy Park, thank you for calling. You're on Brian Lehrer Live.
Hi, this question was to follow up the tipping point. Before, Osama bin Laden used to use videotape as a method to distribute his message to the world. And it seems as though now, in the past year or two, he hasn't been doing that. In fact, he might have been using, by means of cassette or writing, to display his message. I was wondering if now would be a correct time to use videotape to reason out why such things are occurring in Jordan and other parts.
Okay. Why does Osama bin Laden use videotape, first of all?
I mean, I think this is one of the most effective way to reach hundreds of millions of people, to reach the Muslim community, to reach the base. It's a very effective, I mean, this is a modern instrument of propaganda. But it seems to me on the question of Osama bin Laden, we have not heard, Brian, from Osama bin Laden in the last 10 months. There's a great deal of speculation. What has happened to Osama bin Laden? Is he alive? Is he dead? In fact, the public face of Al-Qaeda today is his second-hand man, Ayman Zawahiri, who is, I mean, his deputy, and Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi, Al-Qaeda leader in Iraq.
And what about Zarqawi and bin Laden? Do they get along? Are they rivals? Do they talk, assuming bin Laden's alive?
Brian, again, this is a critical question. In fact, before 2004, Al-Qaeda leadership, the parent organization, Ayman Zawahiri and Osama bin Laden, were very suspicious of Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi. They perceived him as hasty, as reckless, as dangerous. But of course, in October and November 2004, they realized that Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi is a very useful instrument. He is the field commander. He is fighting the global war in Iraq against the American occupiers. He is the man in charge now. And this is why Osama bin Laden decided to appoint Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi as his prince or emir in Iraq.
So has the United States created, with the war in Iraq, one of the very things that they went into Iraq to prevent, an established al-Qaeda base exporting terrorism?
Brian, in my book, The Far Enemy, Why Jihad Went Global, I show, truly empirically, not ideologically, that by 2003, Al-Qaeda was in a coma. Al-Qaeda received some major military crippling blows.
In a coma? Just 2 years after 9/11?
Absolutely. Because the international alliance led by the United States, the international community, Muslim states, European states, played a major role in isolating Al-Qaeda. The American-led invasion, occupation of Iraq, and again, this is an empirical point, the consensus in the US government, in fact, has provided Al-Qaeda with a new lease on life. It has played into Al-Qaeda hand. And in fact, as the third man in Al-Qaeda, Saif al-Adl, is the military commander of Al-Qaeda, said, the Americans fell into our trap by going and plunging head-on into, I mean, the heart of the Arab and Muslim world. And yes, it seems to me, the consensus within the American intelligence community and the European community, Iraq now has become a recruiting ground for militant jihadist causes including Al-Qaeda.
Let's take another phone call. Barbara in Manhattan, you're on Brian Lehrer Live. Hello.
Hello. Yes, this is a follow-up. Brian sort of took my question, but I have another question. How do you know that Zarqawi was appointed as the prince of Al-Qaeda in Iraq? And also, I was under the impression that Al-Qaeda really didn't exist anymore, that a lot of these groups just came up by themselves. And the news reports in America keep talking about Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is really misleading.
Right, it's a good question. We do hear often that there is no such thing as Al-Qaeda. It's now decentralized, localized, Al-Qaeda-like movements.
Absolutely. In fact, and that's what when I said in 2003, the centralized decision-making, the command and control structure of Al-Qaeda was dismantled, almost dismantled by 2003. Now what you have now are local affiliates who have taken action into their own hands, including Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And this is why, in November 2004, Osama bin Laden and Ayman Zawahiri realized that Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi, was an effective man, and this is why, in fact, they jumped on the wagon of Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi and appointed him as Al-Qaeda man in Iraq.
I've heard that polls in Jordan show that about half the people there support the insurgency in Iraq. You think that's about accurate?
I would say more than half. I would say it's in really the high 70s, not just in Jordan. Brian, throughout the Arab and Muslim world, there is an overwhelming public support for the, they call it, of course, the resistance, al-muqawama. It's not an insurgency. We call it the insurgency here. And you might say, why? After all, the United States toppled Saddam Hussein, a brutal dictator. In the eyes of Arabs and Muslims, they don't buy the American narrative. They don't buy the American story. And in the eyes of Arabs and Muslims, there is an Arab and Muslim land occupied by the United States. After all, Baghdad, the capital of Iraq, was the capital of the Islamic Caliphate for 1,000 years.
So let me take your number. Let's say you have high 70% of Jordanians supporting the insurgency in Iraq, and now suddenly here is Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the leader of that same insurgency, Zarqawi, masterminding an attack in Jordan on Jordanians who work at that hotel. It was mostly Jordanians who were killed, not Americans or Israelis or others. What does that do to the public opinion?
Well, I mean, I think public opinion now, this is why I said, I mean, it seems to me that Arab and Muslim public opinion is turning against the global jihadist movement as led by Ayman Zawahiri, Osama bin Laden, and Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi. But Brian, there is a major distinction here. On the one hand, Arabs and Muslims say, we denounce Al-Qaeda. We denounce even militant Islamists. I have interviewed really dozens, scores of radical Islamists who say, well, listen, resistance must be civilized. We must, in fact, practice civilization when we fight the occupation. On the other hand, they say resistance against the American occupiers' occupation is legitimate. So there's a major distinction here.
How do you interview jihadis? You know what happened to Daniel Pearl when he tried to interview jihadis. Is it a dangerous business for you?
Well, I mean, I was very fortunate because I began to interview Islamists and radical jihadists and radical Islamists in the late 1990s. In fact, I spent 2 years in 1999 and 2000, and of course, long before 9/11. Now,
I know that your first book on the topic was out before 9/11.
Absolutely. Now the situation has changed dramatically. Would I go to Iraq and try to interview jihadists? No. Would I go to Afghanistan, Pakistan? Of course not. The situation has qualitatively, Brian, and dramatically changed. There is war. And when there's war, there are many casualties, including journalists, reporters, and researchers.
There's an article in the new issue of The Atlantic by James Fallows in which he describes Iraq breaking up in the way that it seems to be breaking up, and says what it seems to be coming to in the central part of the country is something he calls Sunnistan. Sunnistan, obviously the mostly Sunni-populated part of the country that has more support for the insurgency because they feel left out by the new Shiite and Kurdish-dominated government. And he says Sunnistan, if it's allowed to develop, would become, in a way, like the old Afghanistan, a pretty lawless place run by warlords and run by Al-Qaeda. It would be a real kind of ongoing international Al-Qaeda base, much in the way Afghanistan was before September 11th. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. In fact, in the last chapter in my book, I call it, the Iraq generation. That is, the American-led invasion and occupation of Iraq appears to have planted the seeds of a new generation of jihadists. And one of the most neglected aspects of the Jordanian attacks on the 3 hotels is that here you have Iraqi jihadists, Iraqi terrorists going into a neighboring Arab states and carrying out suicide bombings. What has happened in the last year or so, Brian, is that it seems to me Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi, the Iraqi prince or emir in Iraq, has developed a homegrown Iraqi base of operation, and this is a very alarming development.
So what can be done about that? Is the solution military?
No, not at all. I mean, this is at the end of the day, Brian, in Iraq, this is a political struggle. Iraqis don't see eye to eye on the major issues. Iraqis are divided. There is a low-intensity civil war taking place in Iraq. And this is why now it's essential to make sure that this nascent operational base does not expand and become like Afghanistan in the 1990s.
Another phone call. Patrick, you're on the air. Hello.
Hello. I've been listening to comments recently by Ahmed Chalabi, who is now sort of trying to cover up the tracks of what he had been laying before. And one interesting sort of cloud that he's been developing is that he is now sort of says as directly as he can, in his way, that Saddam Hussein was involved with Osama bin Laden. And one of the sort of ways that he posits is that he says that there's so many documents captured after the fall of Hussein that we'll never know the truth for about 20 years. And he actually sort of brought in Alger Hiss in a sort of indirect way as an example of how the truth of this matter will not be known for 20 years. So basically sort of inoculating himself against being wrong. Any comments on the sort of role that this guy is evolving now?
Thank you for your question. I think we know the facts now. I mean, I think American commissions, government commissions, we know that there was no operational relationship between the Saddam Hussein regime and Al-Qaeda. This is now an established fact.
The Senate Intelligence Committee concluded that.
And the 9/11 Commission, no operational relationship. And we know that Iraq did not have non-conventional weapons. And those two ideas, those two arguments, where, I mean, the administration based its invasion and occupation of Iraq based on these two facts. And regardless of what Ahmed al-Jalabi says or doesn't say. The facts are now well known. Iraq did not have non-conventional weapons. Saddam Hussein, regardless how brutal he was, did not have an operational relationship with Al-Qaeda.
One last thing. Your book was written, obviously, before the riots in France. Do you think reaching out to those young Muslims and others like them in the cities of Europe is important to preventing future terrorist attacks, or is that a completely separate dynamic?
I don't think the riots in France had anything to do with Al-Qaeda. It was basically a socio-economic situation. Even the French President Chirac said, this is a question of identity belonging to the French nation. But of course, what you want to do is you want to prevent Al-Qaeda and other militant groups from infiltrating Muslim communities in Europe. And the best way to do it is to integrate, to help integrate the communities into the social fabric of European society.
Do you think Al-Qaeda is trying to recruit, let's say, in the suburbs of Paris? And if so, with any success?
Brian, Al-Qaeda has been trying to recruit everywhere. I mean, he asked me a while ago about the videotapes. The videotapes are one of the most effective instruments to reach into Muslim populations everywhere, including the United States. In fact, we know that the bombers, the suicide bombers in London, in particular Mr. Sadiq Khan, he said very clearly, he made a videotape before he carried out the suicide bombing. He said, well, Osama bin Laden is our leader. I'm a foot soldier in the global jihad movement. So yes, Al-Qaeda has been trying to recruit young Muslims everywhere, including Europe and the United States.
And you write near the end of your book that the United States and its Western allies can contribute significantly to Al-Qaeda's internal state of siege, as you call it, by reaching out to the large floating middle of young Muslim opinion and listening closely to their fears and hopes and aspirations. What do you think their fears and hopes and aspirations are that the U.S. can actually get them to identify with?
I mean, the argument I made that this war cannot be won on the battlefield. We are fighting the wrong war. We're not facing a conventional army whereby we can vanquish. We are facing, now a decentralized local affiliates. The most effective way to fight this war is to complete the internal encirclement by appealing to 60% of Muslim population are under the age of 25 years old. Why not give them hope by trying, for example, to keep a distance from oppressive rulers, by resolving regional conflicts like the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, like the Iraqi conflict, and so on and so forth.
So in a way, the United States, if it does what President Bush promised it would do, is making the same near enemy in the Middle East as the jihadists have, and that is these undemocratic, despotic, mostly Arab regimes. And yet the United States' vision of an alternative to that is very different from the Al-Qaeda alternative.
Absolutely. I mean, no one is suggesting, Brian, that the administration's rhetoric is not good. I like the rhetoric. I like the talk about democracy, about freedom, about open society, about the rule of law. But you cannot do that by using American armada in one place, while at the same time go to bed with some of the bloodiest dictators in the Middle East. We must be consistent. We must respect the rule of law. We must really help this, what I call the floating middle of Muslim public opinion, that is the 60% young constituency.
The Far Enemy is a very interesting book. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you, Brian.
Coming up in a minute, how the Bloomberg campaign reinvented who you are and what group you belong to in New York City. This is Brian Lehrer Live.
When it comes to continuing education, all stops lead to CUNY. More than 200,000 New Yorkers of all ages in all 5 boroughs are enrolled in CUNY adult education courses. If you're looking for new job skills to enhance your career, start a new career, or if you want to enjoy a class in the arts, sciences, and humanities, then get on the train and come to one of CUNY's 19 campuses. CUNY continuing and professional education programs offer you more opportunities than any other learning institution in New York City. CUNY gives you high-quality instruction at low cost with schedules to meet your busy lifestyle. For more information, call 1-866-344-CUNY or log on to www.cuny.edu/continuinged. Hurry up, don't miss your stop, come to CUNY.
world-famous art star.
What? Oh, there's something like it.
To make art.
What's going on in New York?
Art or something like it.
And I'm a photographer.
The life of an artist or something like it.
I say, watch art or something like it.
This is Brian Lehrer Live. We're here live every Wednesday night this fall at 7:30. You know, one of the most interesting things about Mayor Bloomberg's reelection campaign turns out to be some new ways in which they categorized us, voters. After extensive and expensive telephone polling, they concluded that the old categories of race, class, and political party were not the most relevant to this election. Rather, they discovered what they called thought-based groups that cut across those lines. New York Times correspondent Jim Rutenberg wrote this up in yesterday's paper and joins us now by telephone. Hi, Jim. Thanks for coming on.
Hey, Brian. How are you?
Good, thanks. What does that mean, thought-based groups?
Well, I guess what they... let me throw another one at you. These are psychographic profiles of voters.
Sounds scary.
Basically, these are groupings of voters based on how they view themselves in the city and what they want in a mayor.
So your article identifies some specific thought-based groups, such as fans, cultural liberals, and the middle. Let's take one. What are fans?
These are what they call fearful and anxious New Yorkers. And it's interesting because, in a way, these would be people who, Fernando Ferrer, his Democratic opponent, referred to as they live in the other New York. These are people who are sort of, they're making a living, but they're kind of hanging on by just a string. And so anything that was to happen in the city would really affect their livelihoods. Any sort of attack that would wipe out or close down the airports, for instance, might affect this group of people because many of them may work in airports. And so Bloomberg could speak to these people and about securing our future, instituting new anti-terrorism programs, but it was with an eye on their livelihood.
So that's thought-based, but it also sounds class-based, would you say?
This one is a bit more class-based. It is. I mean, some of them aren't, right? But this one's a bit more class-based, yeah.
And it's funny because we often hear that those voters who are more struggling economically are the ones less concerned about terrorism. They're the ones who'd be more concerned with the traditional issues like making sure the schools are good, like affordable housing, who see terrorism as a remote, unlikely threat to them, and who have so many threats to their lifestyles as it is, that they can't get too concerned about a low-risk terrorist attack. But that category really ties those two concerns together.
It's because that's what you were talking about. And by the way, I'm sure those are also concerns, but it's sort of a pre-9/11 mindset, right? And I think what the Bloomberg campaign understood perhaps better than the Ferrer campaign was that 9/11, even as a fade from memory, has had a lasting effect on the city politic for now, at least.
Let's take another of those groups. Who are the cultural liberals?
I would say these are largely probably, let's see, they might live in Park Slope, they might live on the Upper West Side, they might live in Tribeca, they may live in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. I think this group's a little bit more white, but again, there are all races mixed up in all of these, and these are people who care about either the arts or social programs, not because they use them, or let me restate that. They care about the arts. Kids care about the arts. Some may care about social programs, not because they use them, but because they see them as vital to the city. They care about people. They're liberal, and they understand that fiscal management has to do with keeping these programs surviving.
So how did the Bloomberg campaign use this information, these thought-based or psychographic groups, to win the election?
Well, then because you know what they were doing? They were figuring out what matters most to you based on these issues, right? And then they could pump out parts of their record that would appeal to you, and to huge effect, right? Because we already know he was advertising like crazy, right? He was emailing like crazy. They were calling like crazy. But he was blanketing you with what they surmised you wanted to hear about.
And in a way, this is not such a brand new idea. I mean, advertisers have been using the notion of psychographics to scope out what potential buyers want for years and years, right?
Sure, but politics always lags advertisers, and politics is still lagging advertisers, because if you talk to some of these Bloomberg guys, they might tell you this. The next step in marketing right now is hitting you as an individual. What do you want individually? What do you have on your iPod? What do you watch on TV? You can TiVo it. It's all on your terms. So the next step they would tell you is to give you politics on your terms.
And in the end, doesn't it all come down to the same issues? You don't need a doctorate in research methods to figure out, housing, education, security, and prosperity.
I guess, but then if it was so easy, what was Ferrer doing wrong? I think it's simple, but at the same time, it's easy to do it incorrectly. Give me
a quick example of how one of these categories cuts across the usual assumptions about racial lines.
Well, let's look at another one is homeowners. This one to me is the most concrete of these. It's a little different. It's not quite psychological, right? But this is a cross-group kind of grouping that they have. So the white homeowner, the black homeowner, the Latino homeowner all have very similar concerns. They've invested in the city. So when you talk about schools, they think about schools in terms of the future of the city. When you talk about crime, that matters to them perhaps even more because, again, they've invested in the city. They've put their roots down here. So it doesn't matter what color you are.
So looking to the future, are these categories that other city candidates will just be able to apply to their own campaigns, or would they have to do new research?
I don't think they can, because you know what Bloomberg had the money to do, which was amazing to me personally, was they just could call a huge percentage of the actual electorate. So for citywide, I don't know how many people will be able to afford to do that.
You quote the mayor's campaign manager, Kevin Sheehy, by the way, saying this research probably will not inform the way the mayor governs in his second term. Why wouldn't it if they have all this new insight into people's concerns?
Because I believe them when they say this, but I'm always open to being disproved, right? But the mayor is supposedly philosophically completely opposed to governing by polls. And I've heard it since I've been here at City Hall, and I haven't seen anything to disprove it.
All right. We'll see what happens in the second Bloomberg term. Jim Rutenberg from The Times, thanks so much.
Thank you, sir.
And that's it for tonight's Brian Lehrer Live. We're here live every Wednesday night this fall at 7:30. See you next week. In the meantime, join me for my radio show, weekday mornings at 10 on WNYC, New York Public Radio. Tomorrow we'll have advice for seniors on how to navigate the Medicare prescription drug benefit. That's on 93.9 FM and 820 AM. Have a great night.